the book of Esther. And while you're turning there, I'm going to pause and lead us in a word of prayer and see if God will join us during this teaching time. So, Father, we thank you for this, your church, people that are called by your name. And God, I know that for myself, I often long to have been a part of seeing you move in great ways, seeing you part waters and bring down walls, and to have the sun stand still. And so, God, I know in my own life I've often said, I'm sure I would be a better Christian if I could have seen you move like you did in the Old Testament. And God, sometimes it's difficult to live in a time where we don't necessarily see the miraculous. And so, God, I would pray that over this next 8 weeks that we would truly be able to recognize that you are moving, you are working behind the scenes, and that you reign today as much as you did back then. And so, God, I would pray you would speak to our hearts, use me as your messenger to give forth the message that you want this, your people, to hear. Hide me behind the cross. Let me not be a stumbling block to your message this morning. And I ask these things in Jesus' name. And God's church said, Amen. Amen. Well, we are in a new series called When You Can't See His Hand. If you look at this graphic on the wall, the idea is that if you tore back the wallpaper of life, you'd see God's hand present in the midst of all of it. I wonder by a show of hands, and maybe this is too convicting for you, but I wonder by a show of hands how many of you have ever thought, man, if I was around at the time of Moses, I'd have a better walk with Jesus. Maybe I'm the only one, that's fine. Maybe you could say to yourself, boy, if I saw Jesus raise the dead, if I saw him open the eyes of the blind, if I saw him cause the lame to walk, the blind to see, and heal somebody of something like leprosy, I'd be like, man, I'm all in, and I know God is with me. If anybody else like that? Okay, now I got hands all over the place. I wonder if anyone's ever asked the question of, how come God doesn't work like he did in the Old and the New Testament? Anybody ever ask that question? Or maybe you've thought to yourself, doggone it, life is kind of hard. And we live in a godless culture where God has been removed from the public arena. He's no longer in the courtroom. We can't say his name in schools. Where is God today? Anybody ever ask those questions? Or maybe you're looking at your life and your circumstance and you're thinking, boy, I might be able to see God in somebody else's situation, but I certainly don't see him in mine. Boy, that would be a little harder to raise your hand to, huh? But if you can answer the question yes to any of those questions in this next series, When You Can't See His Hand, is for you. And this is a series that I've been excited about because, loved ones, it is a series for me. Because over the next 8 weeks, we're going to see that God moves in regular people. People who you might look at and say, boy, they really don't measure up. They don't look like a typical biblical hero like maybe Daniel. I know when I look at Daniel, I go, boy, he was practically perfect in every way. Daniel is the Mary Poppins of the Bible. And I look at Daniel and I go, I don't measure up. But I look at a character like Esther. And here's a fearful individual who keeps her faith a secret for multiple years, and yet over the process and the journey of this book, we're going to see her step out of her fear and step into courage, and we're going to see God develop and change her to impact an entire people. And I say, well, I kind of relate to a woman like Esther. In fact, I want to give you some background as we jump into the book of Esther. Esther was written during the Medo-Persian Empire. You recall that the nation of Israel was taken into captivity by the Babylonians. And then at the end of the Babylonian Empire, there was a guy by the name of Cyrus, and he's the first of the Medo-Persian Empire, and he sends the Israelites home. He gives the decree, go back and build your temple. And about 100 years later, 100 years after the time of Daniel, Esther is going to take place. Now, it's a fascinating book, Esther. There's 10 chapters in this book, and you cannot find one reference to God. God's name is completely absent from the book of Esther. In fact, if you were to look through all 10 chapters of the book of Esther, you cannot even find a pronoun pointing to God. In fact, there's people like Martin Luther, that he gets credit for starting the Reformation, Martin Luther said, boy, this book does not even belong in the Bible. Scholars like Josephus say that Esther is the absolute last book that was written and added to the Old Testament canon. And it's a book that we're going to see that even though you can't see God's name, even though you can't see a pronoun pointing to him, that if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, you're going to see that he is working behind the scenes through every chapter, every verse of this story. Amen. In fact, there's 3 main themes that we're going to unpack as we move through this series. The first is that God is working behind the scenes in this book. And the application is going to be that God is working behind the scenes in your life. Chapter 1 takes place about 5 years before the main plot line of this story develops. And God is already moving one individual out of power and putting somebody else into power so that he can be ready. And loved ones, God's doing the same things for you. He's moving people, moving places, moving circumstances. And so the first theme that we're going to see in the book of Esther is that God is working behind the scenes. The second theme that we're going to discover as we move through the book of Esther is human responsibility. You and I have a choice. Amen. You and I have a choice to be used by God mightily. There's a passage that's going to come later in our series where Mordecai says to Esther, deliverance is going to come. It's either going to come through you or it'll come through somebody else, but perhaps you have been made queen for such a time as this. We have a personal responsibility to understand that God has placed us in our circumstance, in our situation for such a time as this. But God's not going to force you to move. He's not going to force you to act. He's not going to force you to obey. He's going to move. He's going to act. He's going to bring deliverance. And if you want to be a part of it, you have to say, I'm going to step out of my comfort zone into a spot where God can use me. There's personal responsibility. And then third, the final theme that we're going to see as we move through this book is that wickedness does not reign. Amen. Wickedness does not reign. We live in a culture that is godless. I looked up in the dictionary, Webster's dictionary, what the word godless or godly is. And godly is full of love of God. And I look at our culture and I go, there's no love of God in our culture. We've removed him from the public square. We've removed him from the courthouses. We've removed him from the schoolrooms. And God laughs at that. God laughs at wickedness and says, I am omnipresent. You can't remove me from anything. I am there. So we're going to discover wickedness does not reign. And I love the book of Esther. This is a book that if you've got eyes to see is filled with humor. It is filled with romance. It is filled with action. It is filled with irony. And it's a book where God says, join me in all of these emotions. And we should be having a good time as we move through the book of Esther. Just a little bit more historical background, and then we're going to jump right into the text. At the time that Esther is written, the Medo-Persian Empire extends to 127 provinces. The Medo-Persian Empire is taking up the entire known world. So if you were to move to the to the west, you'd find Italy in its uttermost west part. Then you'd journey south down into Egypt. And then you would turn eastward and head all the way over to India. And when you hit India, you'd want to turn north and you get to about central Russia. And this is the Medo-Persian Empire. empire, 127 provinces that this king is in charge of. And yet, Israel is in the midst of all of this. And then all over this empire, you've got a polytheistic groups of people speaking different languages and different cultures, and they're all worshiping countless gods, except for this one strange group of people called Jews. And they got these funny cultures and these funny deals where there's only one true God, and so all of these other nations, a part of this empire, look at the Jews with mistrust. And so that's the context that we get. You see, Cyrus sent a group of people home, but Israel is still a part of this empire. And so there's a group of Jews living at home still under exile. And there's still another group of people that are hanging out in Persia, which we would know as modern-day Iran. And so you've got all of this stuff going on as we get to chapter 1. So if you have your Bibles open, I would invite you to turn to Esther chapter 1. Let me see if I can kind of set some context for you. You've got a king. And as I read chapter 1, you know what I thought of? I thought, I am in the supermarket looking at some tabloid. I felt like I was reading about the Oscars. And you got this king who wants to show off his great wealth. And so he has a massive party. And he's displaying his wealth for 6 months straight. And then he invites all of these people out to his palace, and he says, I'm not joking, it's right there in the text, read along, you can see it. He says it's going to be an open bar. The biggest open bar that anyone has ever heard of. Tell them they can drink as much of whatever they want. They name it, you make it, and you just give them seconds. Keep them drinking. And so I'm thinking, doggone, this is a very fleshly opening to a book in the Bible. Where's God in the midst of all of this? And so you got this king, and he's having this massive party. And all the guys, all the gents are a part of one group. And his drop-dead gorgeous wife, Vashti, she's having her own party for all the gals. And you get this picture that all of these guys are getting to a state of, we'll say that they're slightly inebriated. And at the end of the party, the king calls for the queen. See, he's showed off his wealth for this entire season, and now he wants to show off his woman. Queen Vashti, come into my presence now so that I can show you off to all the men in my kingdom. And Queen Vashti says, no! Go stuff it! I'm not coming! Well, that's a problem, isn't it? You got a guy that's running 127 provinces. He's in control of an entire empire, and he can't control his wife. That's a problem. And that brings us all the way up to verse 15. He's scratching his head. He doesn't know what to do with his wife. He says, according to the law, what should be done to Queen Vashti? Because she's not performed the command of the king delivered by his eunuchs. This is what happens. You've got 7 guys that have been castrated, and he trusts these guys implicitly, go get my beautiful wife. So these 7 castrated dudes go up to collect the wife, and she says no. Now, the women's lib is nothing new. It's taking place where I am not going to come. And so what the king does is he doesn't know what to do, so he calls together this wise council of men to seek some advice. What should be done in a thing like this? This has never been done. This is kind of fascinating. Then Memucan was set in the presence of the king and the officials. Now watch this. Not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the people who are in all of the provinces of your kingship. She's creating a problem. Because right For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. Oh, king, this is a problem. Domestic order throughout the entire kingdom is about to collapse. Society as we know it is about to come to an end. This is a very fragile system, and Queen Vashti is about to bring down the whole pagan thing. Oh, Vashti, what have you done? Ooh. Fragile system indeed. Verse 18. This very day, this isn't hyperbole, this is what's going on in the text. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all of the king's officials. And there will be contempt, and there will be wrath in plenty. O king, you have got a problem. So the king is saying, what should I do about it? What can possibly be done? Verse 19. The solution. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him and be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that they may not be repealed, that Vashti is to never again come before the king. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she is, or at least more submissive. And the king is thinking, boy, this sounds like a great idea. I'll banish my wife. I'll banish her. And then we'll promote somebody else, and I'll get a new queen, one that I can control, and one that will come when I call. Now, this is taking place about 5 years before the plot of the story unveils itself. And I got one point that I'm wanting us to understand as we are setting the stage for this journey that we're going to be taking together as a church for the next 8 weeks. Today is week 1. God is working behind the scenes. Amen. See, God already knows. He's already downstream, and he's already very aware of this wicked, vile Haman who's going to try to destroy his people. And so God is already moving. He's already saying, you know what? I'm gonna allow a circumstance to take place where a queen is displaced. And then I'm going to work through the vile, disgusting, humanistic, fleshly desires of a king. And I'm going to promote up my servants. And she's an imperfect person. Yes, she is. But she's going to be in place at just the time when I need her to be there. And what's interesting is we can look at this text some thousands of years later and we get to see the entire picture played out before us. But do you think anybody in the midst of this story was able to see God in the midst of it? I say no. When you're going through life, it's hard to see God's weaving and working and placing and moving. It's hard. But loved ones, I want you to know God is doing it. He's working behind the scenes of your life, your circumstance, your situation. He's saying, I got this. It doesn't feel good right now. It may feel like it's out of control. And you may think, boy, it's going to a place I don't want it to go. But he's saying, I got this. Just trust me. I'm working. So the king, in verse 22, he sent letters to all of the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, to every people in its own language, that every man should be the master of his own household. He says, doesn't that sound very Western? We are losing control, so we will legislate control. Thus says Congress, it's now been signed by the president, you husbands are the head of your own house. It has been said, let it be so. It's going to create a problem. But that's going to bring us to chapter 2. Now, back in 2001, there was a song that was written. And it was called Trust His Heart. And what I'd like to do is the sound people are going to be putting this video up on the screen. And I want to close with this song, because this is really the point of today's message. It's really the point of this entire series that we're going to be moving through. Is that even though you can't see God moving, you can't see the supernatural working. He's not causing the sun to stand still. He's not bringing down walls. He's not parting waters. God is still alive, He is still moving, He is still active today. Go ahead, sound people, go ahead and play that video.
Trust His heart. He holds our future in His hand. So don't live as those who have no hope. Our hope is found in Him. We see the present clearly, but He sees the first and the last. And like a tapestry, He's weaving you and me to something big, just like God is too wise to be mistaken. God is too good to be unkind. So when you don't understand, when you don't see His plan, when you can't trace His hand, trust His heart. He alone is faithful and true. He's faithful. He alone knows what is best for you. So when you don't understand, when you don't see His plan, when you can't trace His hand, trust His heart. Trust His heart. Trust His heart. Trust His
This is going to be our journey for the next 7 Sundays. I would invite you all to be a part. Don't Here's a book that has 10 chapters, and 10 chapters we don't see God's name mentioned, we don't see a pronoun. He is hiding behind the scenes. And yet he is constantly moving and working and tipping the scales on the favor of his people for their deliverance. And then it ends with a huge celebration. And God is doing the same exact things for you, and he's doing the same exact thing for me. Let's close in a word of prayer. Jesus, I thank you that you love us. And God, life can be sometimes difficult, and I look at the book of Esther, and I look at the culture and the reality that we find ourselves in today, and it's so easy to say everything is so fleshy, everything is so materialistic, everything is so much about me and about the people around me, and not at all about you. And yet, God, you're moving, you are present, you are alive, and you are working, and you're moving pieces and circumstances and situations for our good and your glory. So God, over the next 7 weeks from today, I would pray that you would help us to look for you in the midst of our circumstance. God, help us to see you more clearly. And God, even if we can't, we would pray that you would help us to trust your hearts. And God, as we leave here today, we go out into our life and just face another week, I would pray that you would help us to be cognizant of what our mission is, and that's just to say, hey, you know what, God's working in my circumstance, he's working in yours, why don't you come check him out and meet him on a Sunday. So God, help us to be a missional people. God, help each person here to know that you love them and that you've got them right in the palm of your good hands. I ask this in Jesus' name, and God's church said, Amen. You're dismissed. Have a great Sunday.